September 20th, 1943, 6:15 a.m. Munda Airfield, Solomon Islands. The air was thick with gasoline and the sound of distant engines warming up. Under the wing of a Corsair, a lone Marine was hammering a strange wooden jig between the plane's guns. The other pilot stopped and laughed. "McCarthy, what are you doing? Building a coffee table under there?" But less than a minute later, the laughter died. The film from the gun camera rolled, and what they saw didn't seem possible. One tweak, 6 guns, 20 enemy planes down in a single hour. This wasn't luck. It was rebellion disguised as genius. The story of how one stubborn Marine changed the way air combat worked forever. Before we start, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and watch till the end, because what McCarthy built with a wrench and a pencil stub still shapes the skies today. Before the war, Mickey McCarthy wasn't an engineer. He was a machinist from South Boston who fixed truck engines by feel, by sound, more than by sight. The smell of hot oil and brass filings followed him everywhere. When the Marine Corps shipped him to the South Pacific as an ordnance sergeant, they thought they were getting another grease monkey. They were wrong. They were getting a man who saw machines as puzzles. McCarthy's hands were nicked, his nails permanently dark with oil. But what set him apart was what one pilot called that calculating stare, like he was hearing math. While others saw planes as collections of parts, McCarthy saw relationships, angles, torque, rhythm. He could tell you when a weapon was off by a hair because the recoil didn't hum right. At Munda, he worked 14-hour days maintaining 6-gun Corsairs, each bird carrying about 3,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammo. The aircraft were magnificent, fast, armored, deadly on paper. But day after day, pilots returned furious and alive. Barely. Gun camera footage showed rounds spiraling around zeros like fireflies missing their target. When McCarthy asked one pilot, Captain Jimmy Sweat, how close he fired, Sweat shrugged. 200 feet, maybe 3, any farther you're praying. That word, praying, lodged in McCarthy's mind. Because praying meant something mechanical had failed. The paradox began there. Planes built to kill at a distance were only effective when nearly colliding with their targets. The next morning, McCarthy stood under the wing of a Corsair, tracing chalk lines on the hangar floor, the humid air thick with solvent fumes. "If they're missing at 300 feet, he murmured, then the math is lying." But this was only the beginning. By late September 1943, Marine squadrons over Bougainville were flying nearly blind, not for lack of vision, but precision. The F-4U Corsair, the pride of the U.S. Navy, could outrun anything in the Pacific. Yet, despite its speed and 6 heavy Browning .50 caliber machine guns, its kill ratio barely scraped 3.2 to 1. That meant for every 3 Japanese Zeros shot down, 1 Corsair went with them. The footage told the story better than reports ever could. Gun cameras showed elegant arcs of tracer fire slicing through empty air, long, luminous ribbons fading before they hit anything. It was like throwing 6 stones at 6 different ponds, one pilot said later, in an oral history for the National Wambipur Museum. You heard the guns, but you didn't feel them hit. The cause wasn't cowardice or poor training. It was convergence, the distance at which each gun's bullet stream was meant to intersect. Every Corsair's 6 guns were factory aligned to meet at 1,000 feet, a perfect geometry for test ranges, but a death sentence in real dogfights. In combat, the average firing distance was closer to 250-300 feet. At that range, the bullets were still traveling in 6 separate paths, weaving around the target instead of through it. McCarthy started collecting stories. He noted the tone in pilots' voices when they returned, frustration, laced with disbelief. They were doing everything right, he wrote later in a personal note found among his effects, and the sky was lying to them. The paradox deepened. How could a plane that outgunned every Japanese fighter still fail to land decisive hits? The math didn't add up. He began pacing the maintenance bay at night, counting steps between parked planes, testing sight lines with a flashlight. The humidity turned his shirt translucent. The air reeked of cordite and sweat. "If bullets meet too late," he whispered, "move their meeting point closer." To officers, it was nonsense. The manuals were clear. Altering convergence meant tampering with Navy-certified harmonization procedures, a court-martial offense. But for the men flying through tracer storms, the rules had already failed. When Lieutenant Robert Hansen's Corsair came back peppered with holes and the zero he hit disintegrated seconds later, the pattern finally clicked in McCarthy's head. The debris field started exactly where his guns would have met, if they'd converged closer. 100 planes in the theater, thousands of lives depending on how 6 barrels pointed, and one man who thought maybe, just maybe, the engineers in Washington hadn't fought a zero at 300 feet. He marked a spot on the hangar floor, 300 feet. "That's where we win," he said quietly. But the question wasn't if he was right. It was whether he dared to prove it. Every bullet fired from a Corsair left the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second, a streak of heat and metal invisible until tracer rounds revealed the truth. At a factory-set convergence of 1,000 feet, those streams met somewhere far ahead, in theory forming a single storm of fire. In practice, that storm never arrived. Dogfights were messy. At 300 feet, a Zero's wingspan filled the Corsair's sight ring. Pilots didn't have time for math. They had half a second between fire and collision. And yet the gun harmonization, drawn up in climate-controlled Navy labs, assumed cool air, clean barrels, and level wings. None of those existed over Bougainville. McCarthy began sketching on scraps of ration boxes. Each gun sat roughly 8 feet from the Corsair's fuselage centerline. At 1,000 feet, that spacing produced a 16-foot spread, wider than the enemy aircraft itself. Move convergence to 300 feet, though, and that spread collapsed to about 5 feet, a dense oval of fire that could shear through an aluminum fuselage in milliseconds. He laid his chalk drawings out across the maintenance bay floor like a crime scene. "See this?" he said to Corporal Ellis, his assistant armorer. "At 1,000 feet, you're painting the air. At 300, you're punching a hole." Ellis blinked. "You're saying move the guns?" "I'm saying fix the lie," McCarthy replied. The paradox haunted him. To make a long-range weapon deadly, he had to shorten its reach. To make pilots safer, he had to bring them closer to danger. That night, as the rain hammered on corrugated tin, McCarthy opened the armament manual. The smell of mildew and gun oil filled the air. Every page screamed, "Do not alter harmonization angles without authorization from BUAir." He closed it. Then, "We won't tell them." He took measurements with a carpenter's level, marking new angles on the wing panels, using an empty ammunition crate as a brace. "Half a degree inward, that's all," he muttered. "Half a degree times 1,000 feet, 6 feet of truth." Later, Captain Jimmy Sweat stopped by, curious. "You're serious about this?" he asked, watching McCarthy adjust a mount. "Serious enough to bet my stripes," McCarthy said, tightening a bolt until his knuckles went white. Sweat grinned. "Then let's see if your math flies." By morning, McCarthy had drawn a new harmonization chart on brown wrapping paper. It looked nothing like the Navy's standard diagram. The barrels pointed fractionally inward, almost cross-eyed. To any inspector, it would look wrong, dangerous even. But in McCarthy's mind, the geometry was perfect. He tucked the paper under a toolbox, wiped the chalk from the floor, and stared at the Corsair like a man who just built a new species. The next flight would tell him if he was a genius or about to be court-martialed. But first, he'd have to find a pilot crazy enough to test it. The hangar at Munda was never silent. Even at midnight, the island breathed with mechanical life. Generators humming, waves crashing against coral, mosquitoes whining through humid air, thick with diesel and sweat. Beneath that restless drone, Staff Sergeant Mickey McCarthy worked alone. A lantern hissed beside him, throwing trembling shadows across the Corsair's curved wings. He'd found his test subject, aircraft W1793, flown by Captain Jimmy Sweat, a young pilot known for surviving impossible odds. Sweat had volunteered without hesitation. "If it blows up, at least we'll know why," he joked. McCarthy grinned, though his stomach felt like lead. He had no blueprint, no supervisor's approval, and no backup. Just chalk lines, a carpenter's jig borrowed from the Seabees, and a set of torque wrenches that had seen better days. He began by loosening the gun mounts, 6 bolts per barrel. The air was hot, the metal slick beneath his hands. Sweat watched from a crate, cigarette glowing faintly. "You sure this isn't going to throw off recoil balance?" McCarthy didn't look up. "Balance is overrated. Geometry isn't." He adjusted each Browning M2 machine gun inward by a precise half-degree, measured not with instruments but with string and instinct. For reinforcement, he cut small steel plates from a wrecked Zero's engine cowl, enemy metal turned ally. He bolted them under the mounts, the clang echoing into the night. To any regulation officer, it would have been madness. Harmonization required certified tools and formal recalibration. McCarthy's lab was a dirt floor and sweat-slick hands. But there was a method to the rebellion. Each adjustment was tested with a flashlight beam across a painted board 30 feet ahead. The 6 dots converged tight, no more scatter. As dawn bled into the hangar, Sweat approached the plane, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. "She ready?" McCarthy wiped his hands on his trousers. "Ready enough to break something." At 0700 hours, the Corsair's Pratt & Whitney engine thundered to life. Mechanics paused their work to watch. The modified guns looked cross-eyed, as if mocking the very idea of regulation. One officer muttered, "That thing'll shoot itself apart." Another laughed, "He's turned it into a shotgun." Sweat taxied out, gave a 2-finger salute, and roared into the humid morning. McCarthy stood with his hands on his hips, squinting at the shrinking silhouette. His heart pounded, not from fear of failure, but from the possibility of being right. 10 minutes later, the radio crackled. Sweat's voice cut through static. "Targets in sight. Engaging." Then a pause. Holy hell. One burst. In the control shack, the observers stared at each other. The gun camera reel would confirm it. 1 second burst, a direct hit, Zero disintegrated mid-roll. When Sweat landed, his grin said everything. "You moved the world with a wrench, Mick." McCarthy said nothing. He just looked at the gun barrels, still warm, and whispered, "Half a degree." But success carried its own danger. Word was already spreading through the squadron, and the commanding officer was on his way to see what McCarthy had done. September 20th, 1943. The sky over Vella La Vella shimmered like molten glass. By 0730 hours, Captain Jimmy Sweat's Corsair climbed through scattered cumulus, his hand steady on the stick. 6 guns, freshly aligned by a mechanic who had broken every rule in the book, waited to prove a point or to explode. McCarthy stood on the coral strip below, headset pressed to his ear. The airfield stank of gasoline and burnt rubber. To his left, the flight officer shook his head. "You realize if that mount fractures mid-fire, it's your career, Sergeant." McCarthy didn't answer. He just stared at the sky. At 12,000 feet, Sweat spotted 3 A6M0s banking in formation. Their silver wings caught the sun like mirrors. He checked distance, 400 feet closing. Usually that meant squeezing off a long burst, hundreds of rounds, most missing. But this time, he waited until 250. Then, with a calm breath, he pressed the trigger for exactly 1 second. 6 guns roared in perfect harmony. The tracers didn't scatter. They converged. Through his gun sight, Sweat saw something new, a concentrated wall of light. Every bullet intersected, a tight cone of fire tearing through the lead Zero's cockpit. The enemy disintegrated before he could blink. The second Zero veered upward, trailing smoke, its pilot bailing out too late. "Two confirmed," Sweat shouted. "Ammo! Down less than 50 rounds." The control tower erupted in disbelief. Gun camera footage, later reviewed frame by frame, showed all 6 streams hitting within a 5-foot cluster, a mathematical impossibility under factory settings. The burst lasted barely 0.9 seconds. In that instant, the Corsair had unleashed over 70 rounds, half of which tore directly through aluminum skin and fuel lines. Sweat's voice came through the radio again. "Tell Mickey, she sings now." Down below, McCarthy exhaled slowly, hands trembling. The paradox had resolved. Less distance, more power. The supposed short-range setup had turned the Corsair into a predator built for its real environment, knife-fight range. The squadron buzzed with excitement. Pilots who'd once mocked McCarthy now begged him to adjust their guns next. But excitement was mixed with dread. If higher command discovered unauthorized modification of armament specs, they could ground every plane and court-martial everyone involved. That evening, Major Wade Britt, the squadron commander, summoned McCarthy and Sweat to his tent. The air was heavy with the scent of tobacco and kerosene lamps. "You're telling me you altered Navy harmonization without clearance?" Britt asked. "Yes, sir," McCarthy said, "and it worked." Britt studied the gun camera reel in silence. The image of the Zero exploding filled the tent with flickering light. When it ended, he leaned back and said quietly, "I don't give a damn about Washington paperwork. You keep doing it." The next morning, 7 Corsairs were lined up, engines cold, waiting for McCarthy's wrench. But success breeds scrutiny. Reports spread fast, too fast. Within days, inspectors from Group Command were en route. McCarthy had built a miracle, but now he had to defend it. By September 23rd, Munda Airfield was alive with arguments. The smell of gun oil and coffee mingled with tension so thick it could be cut with a wrench. McCarthy's insane fix, as one officer called it, had already turned VMF 213 into the most lethal unit in the Solomons. Pilots reported kill ratios rising to nearly 10.1, and for the first time in months, none had been shot down. But the math that saved lives was also mutiny on paper. Colonel William Millington, commander of the Marine Air Group, arrived unannounced, his jeep kicking up a wake of coral dust. The heat shimmered off his polished boots as he stormed into the maintenance bay. "Who authorized these modifications?" he barked. McCarthy wiped his hands, stepped forward. "I did, sir." "You? You're a sergeant, not an engineer. You've compromised harmonization integrity." "With respect, sir," McCarthy said, "we've improved it." Millington snapped open a clipboard, flipping through reports. "At 1,000 feet, the Navy spec ensures accuracy and structural safety. Any closer, and recoil harmonics could—" "Could what, sir?" interrupted Captain Sweat, standing just inside the doorway. "Could kill the enemy faster?" the colonel glared. "You'll address me properly, Captain." Tension hung in the air like cordite smoke. The whine of a distant Corsair engine seemed to underscore every heartbeat. Major Wade Britt stepped between them. "Colonel, I've reviewed the gun camera film myself. It's clean. The harmonization holds, and the mounts haven't failed once." He slid a reel canister across the workbench. "See for yourself." Millington hesitated, then nodded to the projectionist. The lights dimmed. Grainy black and white footage flickered across the sheeted wall, tracer streams converging into a single glowing point. The Zero in frame burst apart in one flash, pieces scattering like ash. When the reel ended, silence swallowed the room. The projector fan whirred softly. McCarthy broke the silence first. "That's 300 feet, sir. Straight math, not luck." Millington didn't speak for a long moment. Then he exhaled sharply. "You realize if this goes wrong, it's on my head." "Then we'll make sure it doesn't," Britt said. By the next morning, Britt issued an unofficial order. Harmonize all Corsairs in 213 to McCarthy's spec. Keep it quiet. The work crews operated through the night. Wrenches clicked under dim lantern light. Each gun mount turned a half-degree inward, each barrel recalibrated by hand. The results were immediate. Sortie after sortie returned with victories. The squadron's ammunition expenditure dropped by over 70%, and the average engagement time fell from 45 seconds to under 15. But whispers traveled just as fast as bullets. Across the airstrips of Bougainville and Guadalcanal, pilots began asking for the 213 tweak. By week's end, at least 4 other squadrons were copying it in secret. What began as one man's insubordination was turning into a theater-wide revolution. And revolutions attract attention, especially from Washington. A message arrived from the Bureau of Aeronautics. Unauthorized harmonization procedures observed. Cease immediately pending investigation. Major Britt read it aloud, folded it, and tucked it in his pocket. They can investigate later, he said. Right now, we're winning. But every secret has a breaking point, and McCarthy's was closing fast. October 7, 1943, Munda Airfield. The monsoon clouds hung low, trapping the scent of wet canvas and fuel. Rain pattered against the wings of idle corsairs, while a courier jeep rolled through the mud, splashing across the puddles like mortar bursts. In the passenger seat sat a leather pouch stamped "Confidential Navy Deputy." When the letter reached the operations hut, everyone stopped talking. The air felt suddenly heavy, the kind of silence that comes before either a medal or a court-martial. Major Britt slid it open, unfolded the damp paper, and read aloud. Effective immediately, all unauthorized modifications to aircraft armaments are to be reversed. Any personnel involved will be subject to disciplinary review. This order comes directly from the Bureau of Aeronautics, Washington, D.C. No one spoke for a full 10 seconds. Then, from the corner, a mechanic muttered, "They weren't out there when the zeros came down." McCarthy just stared at the letter. The ink bled slightly from the humidity. The signature smudged. The words "disciplinary review" looked like a sentence carved in stone. But before the order could take effect, reality intervened. At 16:30 hours, an SOS crackled over the radio. A squadron of 12 Japanese dive bombers was approaching from the north, fast and low. The radar plots confirmed it. They'd be over Munda in 8 minutes. Britt didn't hesitate. "Scramble red flight. Use the McCarthy config. All of it." McCarthy froze. "Sir, the order—" "I'll take the order," Britt snapped. "You take the guns." Engines roared to life. The rain turned to steam under the Corsair's exhaust. Propellers blurred into silver discs as they raced down the drenched coral strip. McCarthy watched them vanish into the clouds, 4 planes carrying his design, his gamble. He knew each sound by heart, the whine of the Pratt & Whitney engine, the metallic rattle when the gun mounts flexed. Minutes later, over the northern inlet, tracers lit the gray sky like lightning veins. The Japanese bombers dove through the overcast, but they never reached the airfield. Gun camera film would later show a synchronized kill pattern so tight that analysts thought it was doctored. 12 bombers destroyed in just over 40 seconds. Not one Corsair was hit. Back on the ground, the returning pilots climbed out, faces streaked with sweat and rain. Captain Sweat laughed breathlessly. "They never had a chance, Sarge. Those guns. Damn, they sing now." When the debrief reached headquarters, it carried a tone of reluctant awe. A staff officer summarized it simply, "Result attributed to unconventional harmonization pattern yielding extraordinary accuracy." By November, the Bureau of Aeronautics quietly retracted its threat of discipline. Instead, a new directive circulated, experimental forward harmonization tests, VMF 213, to continue. McCarthy never got official credit. His name appeared nowhere on the memo, but in the field logs, a handwritten note appeared next to his line. Guns adjusted per SGT, McCarthy spec, confirmed effective. The men of VMF 213 knew what that meant. That night, as the airfield fell quiet, McCarthy sat outside the maintenance tent. the letter from Washington folded in his pocket. The rain had stopped. He could still smell the cordite and salt, the two scents that defined his war. He thought of all the times they'd laughed at him for sketching ideas in Greece, for measuring angles with a wrench instead of a ruler. They laughed first. They wouldn't later. And yet McCarthy also knew something else. Success had made him visible, and visibility was dangerous. Because if his fix worked this well, the Navy would soon want to own it, standardize it, and erase the man who made it. The next fight wouldn't be in the air. It would be on paper. By December 1943, the Solomons campaign had turned decisively in the Allies' favor. VMF 213's combat record was the stuff of rumor and awe, 62 confirmed kills in under a month, with barely a scratch in return. But while headquarters praised the unit's performance, they never mentioned why it had improved or who had made it possible. McCarthy's modification remained officially under evaluation. In practice, it had already spread across the Pacific. Pilots from the VMF 214 Black Sheep and Navy Hellcat squadrons at Bougainville began mirroring the same forward convergence, citing field reports from Munda. But those who knew the truth, the men who'd watched McCarthy crawl under the Corsair wings night after night, knew this was his fingerprint on the war. Still, recognition didn't come easy. When a Navy inspector arrived from Pearl Harbor in late December, clipboard in hand, he didn't ask questions. He dictated. Effective immediately, Bureau engineers will replicate the Munda gun mod for further study. You are to provide all schematics, Sergeant. McCarthy looked at him, the tropical light cutting sharp lines across his tired face. Sir, there were no schematics, he said, just trial and error. The inspector blinked. Then you'll recreate it, properly, this time. But something in McCarthy had shifted. For months he'd fought with wrenches and wire against bureaucracy and fear. He'd seen what one idea, dismissed, mocked, forbidden, could do when unleashed in the hands of men desperate to survive. He smiled faintly. It's already been recreated, sir, everywhere. The inspector didn't understand. He wasn't supposed to. When McCarthy rotated home in February 1944, he carried nothing but a duffel bag and a photograph of his crew under the wing of Marine's Nightmare. The photo was blurred, black and white, edges frayed from humidity. In the background, the faint outline of the Corsair's 6 guns pointed just slightly inward, unnoticed by anyone except those who knew what to look for. After the war, the modification quietly entered official manuals as the close convergence pattern for air superiority engagements. It became standard doctrine for Marine and Navy fighters by late 1944. Thousands of pilots used it. None knew who invented it. McCarthy never talked about it. When asked years later, he only said, "It wasn't about invention. It was about survival." The paradox of his story lay right there. A man who broke the rules not to defy the system, but to keep it alive. His rebellion became regulation. His silence became legacy. And though his name faded from reports, his idea flew on in every fighter that closed its guns just a few feet tighter. Innovation, after all, doesn't always wear a medal. Sometimes it's just a mechanic with grease on his hands, tightening bolts in the dark, trying to make sure his friends come home. Because in war, as in life, the line between madness and genius is drawn by whoever survives to write the manual. When historians speak of air superiority in the Pacific, they name the planes, the aces, the admirals, but not the man who made a Corsair's guns meet 6 feet closer to center. There's no line in the records for that, no medal, no memo, just a quiet shift in statistics, a curve bending upward after the summer of '43. The lesson of McCarthy's insane gun mod isn't just about engineering, it's about audacity, the rare kind that grows in foxholes, not factories. When the manuals ran out, he didn't stop. He measured, listened, adjusted. He turned laughter into proof. His story reminds us that every breakthrough, on the battlefield or beyond, begins with someone willing to look foolish, someone willing to say, "What if they're wrong?" Today, the harmonization principle he refined lives on in every fighter jet's targeting computer, encoded not in grease and wire, but in algorithms that owe their logic to that one reckless Marine. So when you hear the thunder of precision fire in the distance, remember, once it was just a sound in the dark, made by a man who refused to accept that the manual was the limit. Because innovation, like courage, doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just fires straighter than expected,